warm welcome, everybody, to this World Economic Forum panel on the
rates. I think we'd want to be very confident that inflation is moving back down.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Good morning to those in a different time zone. We're going to start the panel. If I can get your attention, please. Yes, okay, thank you. So good afternoon to those physically present with us and to those watching us online. Good morning to those, or good evening to those in a different time zone. I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel on the global economy today. The goal of our discussion is, in the next hour and 15 minutes, is to provide a global economic outlook for 2023. The global economy today is on a slippery slope amid deteriorating growth prospects, high inflation, aggressive monetary tightening, rising macroeconomic instability, geopolitical tensions, and the global energy crisis. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to the largest commodity shock since the 1970s. Rising food and energy prices are eroding real incomes and leading to a cost of living crisis. Meanwhile, with the increase in government borrowing costs and capital outflows, fiscal and balance of payment pressures have intensified in many developing countries. Several countries in the Middle East and North Africa region are drowning in debt, and many lower income countries are expected to suffer economically for several years to come, especially those that have not yet fully recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic. And economic activity is also weakening in the world's largest economies, the United States, China, and the Eurozone. So the near future looks gloomy. In October 2022, the IMF predicted that the worst is yet to come for the global economy, and the World Bank warned of a series of financial crises in emerging markets and developing countries. So to discuss in greater depth all these issues and the larger ramifications of this economic turmoil, we are very happy to have with us today our four esteemed panelists. So joining us online is Mr. Jihad Azour, who is the Director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF. We're also very happy to have with us today Ms. Rosa Balfour, who is the Director of Carnegie Europe. She works on European politics, institutions, and security and foreign policy. We also have with us today Ms. Kumiko Okazaki, who is a research director at the Cannon Institute for Global Studies. Her work focuses on changes in international capital flows in China and financial system reform in China. We're also very happy to have with us today Mr. Yukon Huang, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Asia Program, where his research focuses on China's economy and its regional and global impact. And I am Nur Arafeh. I'm a fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center. I work on the political economy of the Middle East and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So I first have a few questions to discuss with the panelists for the first hour or so, and then I'll open the floor for questions, for any questions you might have to the panelists. So let me begin with a question for Mr. Azour, joining us online. We witnessed this year growing geopolitical tensions, rising populism, supply chain disruptions that raised questions about whether we're approaching a period of deglobalization with a less connected world, more powerful nation states, retrenchment of global trade, and decreasing influence of multilateral institutions. So in your opinion, Mr. Azour, is there a serious reason to believe that we are currently witnessing the beginning of the end of the globalized world order that we've been living with for the past 30 years?
Thank you, Noor, very much for having me, and sorry to be abroad. And I would like also to thank Carnegie for this important event. The short answer to your question, yes, there is a high level of uncertainty today that global economy will go into a risk of fragmentation. If I have to redraft the title of this session, I would call it the Age of Uncertainty. Since the Second World War, we went into three phases. The first phase was a phase of cooperation, whereby we have established a certain number of mechanisms in order to increase the level of cooperation and remove the barriers that was set before the Second World War. The second phase in the last 30 years was a phase of integration, where through technology, telecom, and finance, we were able to connect also emerging economies and some of the low-income countries. Now there is a risk of fragmentation, and this risk of fragmentation is a real issue that we need to work on to address. Why it's important? Because it could push a big part of the world population into additional poverty. It could slash trillions of dollars of value add that could be created. Therefore, it's an important issue that we need to focus on. What are the three key dimensions here that we need to assess? The first one is access. And the question of access is access to markets through trade, access to finance, and you have mentioned the issue related to capital flows and their liquidity and also their cost. The third dimension is access to technology. We are seeing recently some tensions between US, China, US, Europe on some of the technology issues. Third dimension is access to talent and access to labor. Therefore, access is an important issue. And even I would add access to basic things. Access to basic commodities today is becoming, again, after the war in Ukraine, as an important issue. Access to food and fertilizers. Therefore, access is an important issue that currently we are seeing a reversal of trends. The second dimension is also something that you have mentioned, the institutional framework. The institutional framework that was set after the Second World War with the UN, Bretton Woods institutions, and some of the coordination mechanisms, G7, G20, is also, this framework is currently under test. We saw it during the spring meetings and annual meetings this year of the IMF and the World Bank. We saw some tensions between some of the key shareholders. We saw also a risk of the G20 meetings in Indonesia not being able to organize, and the communique at the end took a long time to be drafted. The third dimension, and here I'll go fast, is the operating model, or if you want, what is the key dimension of the strategy in terms of global cooperation. We see the narrative of importance of producing at home, onshoring, reshoring, friendly shoring, or giving priority to local production, gaining momentum. And this is shifting from being an economic discourse to a political discourse. Therefore, the operating model and as well as also the value system that drives globalization is currently at risk. And this is compounded with your introduction that the global economy will face headwinds. 1/3 of the countries in the world will be in a recession. And this recession could last for longer than expected. Fighting inflation proved to be more challenging, which means that monetary policy will also put a brunt on inflation. And food security issues after the war in Ukraine is a problem for at least 250 million population in the world. Therefore, yes, it's an important issue. 2023 should be a year where we need to reflect also on the way we live together. What are the ways to protect the global public good?
Thank you, Mr. Azour. So we're approaching a period of deglobalization, and there's a risk that deglobalization would have inflationary consequences. And the world has been dealing with higher than expected inflation for the past year. So Mr. Huang, how persistent will current inflation be, in your opinion? What policies can be implemented to combat or to even reverse this rise in prices? And do you already see any policies that are favorable to changing the direction in which the global economy is heading today?
Thank you, Nur. Global inflation is the highest it's been for several decades. And this is occurring at a particularly difficult time. As you mentioned earlier, we have the Ukraine invasion, we have COVID, we have a breakdown in trade relations. If you look at the forecast, inflation was 4.5% last year. This year, it will probably rise globally to around 9%. But the rise will be faster than the decline. So next year, the IMF forecasts inflation to be around 6.5%, and then 2024, maybe 4%. So it'll take us probably 2 to 3 years to get the rate of inflation back to what it was before it rose. At the same time that you're having this kind of anti-inflationary policies, governments are tightening the monetary and fiscal policies, and the impact will be upon growth rates. So the rate of growth forecast for this year globally is around 3.2 or 3.5%. It'll climb next year to maybe 2.7. The variation, both inflation and growth, is likely to be more extreme in advanced economies than in emerging market economies. So Europe, for example, which is growing at 3% this year, may only grow at 0.5% next year. America may be 1%. So you have the dominant West growing at, let's say, 1% next year, and people are worried about recessions. If you look at the forecasts of inflation and growth, let's say 6 months ago, a year ago, what you see is that the major financial institutions have consistently underestimated the extent of the inflationary pressures. And it's basically for two reasons. Initially, they underestimated the demand increase caused by fiscal policies. So in the United States, you have a lot of subsidies and programs to cushion against COVID. In Europe, you had similar kinds of policies. That demand, that increase for commodities exceeding production, that led to what I call inflation above normal. More recently, the inflation increased faster than most people predicted because of what I would call supply bottlenecks and constraints. So most notably, you have the Ukraine crisis. If you look at the risks that are coming, they're energy risks, and we'll have sessions on that. The problem upon Russia, Ukraine, the availability of energy, food price increases, climate change, availability of fertilizer, shipping problems, logistics. They're all leading to a major increase in food. Now, fortunately, over the last couple of months, both energy and food prices seem to have moderated. So maybe this is going to be controllable another way. COVID is another major issue. And the dominant issue in terms of COVID is China. Because if China is unable to somehow deal with these COVID issues, you have a potentially significant increase in inflationary pressures. And that's because China inflation is only around 2%. It may be 9% in the West, but it's 2% in China. If you can somehow tap the Chinese market for more goods, it decreases inflationary pressures globally. But if COVID prevents the production and distribution of goods from China, this has a major impact. What can countries do about the inflationary impact, and how successful will they be? Well, the first issue, of course, is tightening fiscal policies, tightening monetary policies. And most governments have been doing so. The fiscal policy is actually more difficult because the pressure is that you also want to make sure that you protect the vulnerable during this period of time. So that increases the amount of money you want to spend. But the more you spend, the more you contribute to inflationary pressures. So fiscal policies and governments is the major challenge, I would say, for most policymakers. How do they make sure that the vulnerable are protected, at the same time continue to tighten? That's one major challenge. The second, I think, is basically supply bottlenecks. We're making it more difficult in the world because we're now decoupling. We're creating one supply chain for the West. We're trying to isolate another supply chain for China and Russia and other countries. The more that you create separate supply chains, the more you raise prices and costs. So that's another major issue. The third, I would say, is basically trade policies. We have a situation where you would lower or keep tariffs low, inflation would be addressed. But those of us who live in the United States realize that Biden's unwilling actually to lower the punitive tariffs on China. And the more that you have protectionist policies, as is currently being debated between Europe and the United States, the more likely you're going to raise prices. So whether it's monetary fiscal policies, restructuring supply chain, or trade policies, these are the key weapons to address inflation, but they all have particular challenges of their own.
Thank you so much, and we will talk about this later in the panel. But building on specifically on the question of inflation, Ms. Okazaki, are we merely dealing with a period or an issue of inflation, or will the world soon witness a more protracted crisis of stagflation, meaning inflation plus a stagnation of economic growth, or even a recession? And if we are really moving towards a period of stagflation, what would the implications be of that? And how would it be different from the stagflation that the world went through in the late 1970s, early 80s?
Thank you. Looking at the world economy, it seems that the inflationary pressure is strongly. So majority of countries are facing risks of stagflation. Inflationary pressure would continue to exist while the economic recovery from the pandemic shocks would not be strong enough. In addition, Ukraine situation, natural disaster, and some supply chain disorder are showing negative impact for price stability. But I think current situation of the global economy is much complicated than those in 1970s and 1980s. Of course, the causes of the stagflation in 50 years ago were not very simple either. However, the size of the global economy becomes much larger, and the economic structure is much more complicated than those days. For example, this year, the total value of world nominal GDP is estimated 9 times larger than that of 1980. Among them, the total value of emerging market and developing economies becomes 16 times larger, while advanced economy grows less than seven times. The share of the emerging markets and developing economies to the world economy is 44% in this year, which was only 25% 1980. So I think the economic conditions of each country is various, and the impact of price hike would be different even in major countries.
Thank you so much. So all these economic challenges, we're talking about the inflation, the risk of stagflation, deglobalization, and the different challenges that Mr. Huang talked about when addressing like how we can combat inflation. All these have important political and geopolitical implications. And this is where I would like to move to Ms. Balfour. How do you think the economic repercussions, these economic challenges and the economic repercussions in general from the war on Ukraine, how do you think will they affect future policy making in Europe and beyond?
Thank you very much, Nur. And before I start addressing your question, let me just thank Maha and the team here in Beirut for organizing this. It's such a delight to be able to see colleagues, Carnegie colleagues, and having joined during COVID, this is actually, it's the second time I had this opportunity. So I'm very happy to be here and very happy to be in the company of you all. So let me try and look at this question. I'll look at it from, obviously, from a European perspective, but perhaps also from a more political perspective, with respect to the degree to which these massive shocks to the system and how Europe has been responding to them. The war in Ukraine, of course, has huge repercussions on the daily lives of Europeans, of Western Europeans, both in terms of inflation, prices, but also in humanitarian terms. Many families are welcoming Ukrainian refugees. And then, therefore, there are sort of ripple effects also on other areas, such as Europe's migration policies, etc. So it's the consequences are very much felt on European citizens. Also, from the point of view of decision-making, EU member states, the EU collectively, and of course European countries that are not in the EU, are investing massive resources in supporting Ukraine against the Russian invasion. And this, combined with the 2020 shock of COVID, is potentially leading to a bit of a paradigm shift in the way in which the EU conducts its economic business. And it's forcing, first COVID, and we talked about reshoring supply chains, but now also the need to invest in security and defense, and in weaning Europe off Russian fossil fuels. On the one hand, there's a huge opportunity that the EU could seize. On the other hand, there are big challenges. The huge opportunity, of course, is in the degree to which Europe can use this, the combination of these two massive shocks, to transform its economy and lead it towards investing on a green transition and on a technologically based, a technologically driven economy. This is the opportunity. The challenge, of course, is to change the structure of the economy, the way in which Europeans have been thinking about the economy in order to reach this goal. And here, and of course, there's the political dimension as well. The first challenge is, of course, that Europe, the EU, has thrived on trade and on the sort of neoliberal globalization model. And this really implies a transition to a post-neoliberal world. Is the EU equipped to do this conceptually in terms of its rules and in terms of what Europeans agree to spend their money on? And indeed, this leads on to the next point. And again, with COVID, we have seen breaking of a taboo and increased joint borrowing at the European level. Will this continue in order to make the necessary investments to prepare European economy for a green and technological economic transition? And there's a big question mark around that. And then, of course, you have the politics of it as well. The left, those who are left behind, the degree to which European populations are educated and innovative enough to embrace this. So it's massively challenging. And I'll just be brief because I know you want to move on. I think there are two dimensions. I've mentioned the internal dimension, the quintessentially European challenge of this, but of course there's also an external one, and the degree to which Europe is very much focused on itself and on trying to survive this huge transition period, and the degree to which it is able to link up with other parts of the world. And here you have risks of, for instance, scrambling for critical raw materials. You have a risk of, on the one hand, the opportunity for, to promote the green transition, but on the other hand, you also have competing priorities with other parts of the world that could actually imply a race to the bottom. And you have finally, the final piece is just an inward-looking focus that Europe has adopted very frequently at the expense of the rest of the world, because of if the European model or these ideas that I've been discussing is to be successful, it needs to be done in conjunction with the rest of the world and not as an island of with a time limit, because we have the climate crisis looming. It can't be just an island of virtuous behavior. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So moving beyond the EU, Ms. Okazaki, what kind of policies do you think governments need to implement moving into 2023 to emerge from the current economic downturn? And in practice, is there no escape from austerity, like one form of austerity or another during this time?
First of all, I'd like to introduce a recently interesting story about United States policy. Since it's not my main study area, but some analysts say that the possibility of stagnation in the United States is relatively low. The main reason is that the people's inflationary expectation is lower than 1970s. That means this is basically because of the trust to the Fed policy. That means the explanation from the government and the central bank is very important. And considering about the current weak demand, I think most of the governments in the world still need to increase government expenditure. But the expenditure should be focused on where that really need help. The government should also examine the causes of inflation and make policy plan and focus carefully so that the exact timing of easing and tightening policies would support the stable growth. At the same time, I hope the government, I think the government should not give up to find a cooperative way to reduce tension on economic stability and environmental protection.
Yeah, thank you. So we will be expecting tightening monetary and fiscal policy, but hopefully more attention given to the vulnerable and to the vulnerable. So moving on to the MENA region, which has been fighting an uphill battle to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and to curb inflation. At the same time, the MENA region has been going through a serious debt crisis, which will be one of the defining issues of the region next year, especially in places like Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. So, Mr. Azour, how do you think will the increased indebtedness of several states in the MENA region affect Arab regimes and their domestic and regional politics, especially as next year will be characterized by more shortages and tight budgets? And how can international institutions like the IMF ease the suffering of the people throughout this phase?
Thank you, Nur. Well, two comments here. One, the region is summer and winter under the same roof. You have certain number of countries in the Middle East who are enjoying good level of growth, improvement in their balance of payment, and increase in the level of reserves, mainly oil exporter countries and specifically the GCC. In addition, those countries have been able over the last few years, especially since COVID, to improve their competitiveness and also to address the impact of COVID wisely, which helped them recover fast. Therefore, the problem of growth prospects are different in the region in the next couple of years. Yes, there are a number of countries who are facing the problem of increasing debt and slowdown in their economy. And this is mainly the middle-income countries in the region. And those, especially who access international markets to finance their deficit, are going to face an additional challenge because capital flows have reversed and the cost of financing has. And this category are the countries that need to do a growth-friendly adjustment in order to reduce the pressure that is having on them. But we have also a third group of countries, and I want to highlight also the importance of those who are in conflict of stability, where their conditions have deteriorated. The level of growth this year in 2022 was below 1%. For example, for the middle income, the level of growth was relatively benign, around 5.5%, 4.5%, around 6% for a country like Egypt. Therefore, I think here we have to differentiate. The most important impact of debt is not on the political regimes, it's on the economy, because this is erode the level of activity, which means this will reduce the attractiveness of investors and have an impact on growth. Therefore, it's very important to address the debt issue, and addressing the debt issue as well as also the deficit should be and could be inclusive in a sense that it would affect those who are suffering more less, and those who could contribute more. And here, a certain number of reforms have proven to be very important. Subsidy reform that is currently untargeted and benefit the richer has to shift to be more targeted and also providing social assistance to those who need it. Tax regimes can become more progressive, which make everybody contribute and alleviate the pressure on the low-income people. Last but not the least, I think what is important in the next 5 years is how the region can benefit, especially middle-income countries, can benefit from the additional resources that oil exporting countries have, who are currently very much interested in investing in the emerging markets in the region. And improving business environment is going to be very important. In addition to that, there are a certain number of important issues to be addressed. The size of the state and the role of the state. Recently, we did a study that showed that what countries spend on the deficit of SOEs is higher than what they spend on social protection, which is an issue that needs to be addressed. Therefore, reforming SOEs also will help get additional fiscal resources. Therefore, one has to look at the debt issue and addressing the debt issue as priority, but this can be done in various ways, and it should be done while protecting social protection or social transfers and reducing the negative impact on reducing the level of debt on the potential growth of the economies in the region.
Crisis, the global energy crisis, will be a key defining issue in 2023. And this year, European governments have sought to eliminate their dependence on Russian gas, and were locked in negotiations for quite some time over introducing a price cap on Russian oil. And finally, last week, they agreed on a $60 cap for Russian oil prices. Ms. Balfour, do you think the EU will succeed in maintaining a unified energy policy, or will the divisions within the bloc prevent it from doing so? And how will Europe's energy needs reflect on its geopolitical calculations in the future?
Yeah. Well, actually, even the price cap story isn't over. I mean, every day we wake up just to discover that the member states that are in opposition on this and that, and negotiations are continuing. So I understand today the ambassadors meeting at the Coreper, which is the group of ambassadors who make the big decisions, and those they don't manage to go to the levels of foreign ministers or heads of state. They are scheduled to have an 18-hour-long meeting today, which is rather a lot for a scheduled meeting. That doesn't include the extra time needed. So there's still quite a few details that need to be thrashed out, which makes it very difficult to make predictions. What I would say is, about whether this unity will be maintained, the majority of observers believe that at some point the cracking, the unity will crack, will fail. And we do have one outlier, which is Hungary, which is systematically blocking unanimity on decisions that have to do with the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I have to say that I'm perhaps slightly out of the chorus on this one, because so far we have seen that at the end of the day, unanimity has been found. It's not pretty, the way the negotiations are held, there's a lot of horse trading, but eventually the trajectory is one which is heading in the direction, A, of weaning Europe off Russian fossil fuels, increasing diversification of energy sources, but also investing on renewables. So that is the direction of travel. But yes, there are some repercussions. One, I would say that the Hungary question, thinking forward, it will not go away. This relates to what will be talked about in the next session about populism. I mean, with Hungary, it's beyond populism. It's a question of democracy, but also how countries that have decided to abandon democracy, how they function within a democratic system. At the moment, Hungary is quite isolated. And looks to be alone, but this might not be the case in the future. So that constellation, that political constellation, may come about to undermine that. At the moment, on the energy front, the US has also been quite helpful, stepping in with LNG exports. So for the short term, the predictions are that actually on the energy front, Europe can weather this. The problem is in a year's time. And that's where, and I think this is also what the other panelists have highlighted, it's perhaps less for the short term where we're all very preoccupied and looking at, there's a lot of noise and worry, but actually looking forward. And in a year's time, it's going to be difficult to know where we are. Let me just a small thing, because Europe has come to this after a decade of successive crises that have accumulated one on top of the other. And the former president of the European Commission has used the term polycrisis to describe what is happening. And if you think of it metaphorically, it's a bit like playing pool, playing billiards, and the ball can hit another ball and, cause a series of movements, but it can also hit a bunch of balls, and those balls can go in multiple directions. And I think that's very much where we are, which makes it very hard to make predictions, because while, we might be able to predict the course of a certain, X plus Y equals Z, if you have that complexity, it makes it a lot harder. What I'd like to say is that the European Union is this hybrid, strange animal, terribly slow at dealing with crises, et cetera, but what it has is this combination of technocracy and politics, and together they make the EU reasonably well equipped to deal with challenges that have a long-term perspective beyond the electoral cycle of governments. And in this way, that's why we can think about the present crisis also as an opportunity to address what the underlying weaknesses of Europe are, and make decisions that can lead towards solutions.
Yeah. So taking into account the difficulty of making predictions, as you were mentioning, Rosa, another important geopolitical challenge the world has been facing is the US-China competition. And earlier this morning, Maha, Marwan, and Tino, they briefly talked about it, but I would like to discuss it further with Mr. Huang. How do you think will the US-China rivalry, trade war, exchange of sanctions would affect global energy security and global trade in the coming years?
Nur, if you're talking about global energy prices and availability, or you're talking about trade flows in the context of the US-China rivalry, it really comes down to one issue. How rapidly will China grow? Last year, China grew at 8.1%, the largest of any major economy. This year's target was 5.5, but it will not be 5.5. It's going to be closer to 3. And two major factors: COVID, a slowdown in the property market. What about next year? The major forecast of the IMF, World Bank, and others is that China could grow at 4.5% to 5% next year if COVID is moderated and if China can resume its growth. If China grows, let's say, at 4.5% to 5% next year, and Europe grows at 0.5% and America at 1%, China accounts for 40% to 50% of global demand. So when China announced potential softening of COVID policies just a couple of days ago, global commodity markets jumped up. So whether China grows rapidly or not next year will very much shape energy prices and trade volumes. Let me go back to trade. You have a major pandemic. You have COVID. You have supply problems. In the last 2 years, China's share of global exports reached record highs. despite a US-China trade war, which tried to repress China's trade. So what happens? America's buying less from China, relatively speaking. So who is China selling to? China is now selling more to Europe, ASEAN, and Latin America. So China's share of global exports has actually increased rather than declined. So the question is, will China's share of trade continue? Well, that depends a lot upon what's happening in the West, but this is the big issue. What about energy? Here we have a major contradiction. What is it that Europe and America wants from China in terms of the Ukraine war and energy? The basic point was trying to persuade China and India to buy less oil from Russia so that Russia would not earn as much revenues. That was the request. That request didn't make any sense. Suppose China and India did end up buying less oil from Russia. Suppose Russia can't sell its oil to Europe because Europe wants to basically become more independent. That means that global energy supply would decline rapidly. Global energy prices would probably double. No Western government could tolerate that. So there's a basic contradiction which is still being wrestled right now. Is the objective to get Europe to be less dependent upon Russia's oil, or is the objective to get Russia's financial earnings from oil down? And the answer is the West is trying to do both. And the answer as an economist is it's not possible. So there's a major problem in here. Lastly, let me talk a little bit about future policies in terms of the US-China trade. It's no longer about trade between the United States and China. It's about technology. So October 7th, the US Department of Commerce severely restricted China's access to high advanced semiconductors. This is potentially an existential threat to China's ambitions to become more innovative and technologically advanced. It is likely to change the whole ballgame about Taiwan. Taiwan is not just a one China issue. Actually, that's become relatively less important, although everyone focuses on it. The big issue in Taiwan is that it's the home for TSMC, which sells 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors. And here we have a real problem. Suppose China and Taiwan unified peacefully. That's actually untenable for the United States. How could they have TSMC, which sells all the advanced computers, being part of China? Now, suppose the opposite happens. America puts pressures on TSMC not to sell to China. China wouldn't find that intolerable. How could it get advanced semiconductors? So the big issue in Taiwan in the future is not about a one China policy. It's actually going to be about technology. And what do you do with this one particular commodity? The last point I want to make is Russia and China and US tensions are interwoven. Biden basically says this is all about a battle between democracies and autocracies. Autocracy is Russia and China combined. But China and Russia are fundamentally different, culturally, economically, politically. And the big difference from an economist's perspective, which is I am, Russia does not need the global economy to survive. Its energy gives it impunity. That's why it can intervene in Europe and Ukraine recklessly. It doesn't care about the rest of the world. China is completely different. China is the major trading partner for 100 countries. It cannot survive without regular access to the global economy. It cannot prosper without a rules-based economic system. So the big issue in the future is, will there be a rules-based economic system? Is the United States supporting such a system or not? Will China honor such a system? But that is actually the key issue in terms of how do you actually put pressure on China? Because China cannot actually continue to thrive if it's not given access to a rules-based economic system. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights. I'm going to open the floor to the audience. If you have any questions, we're going to have a round of like 3 questions maybe, and then we will have another round of questions. The mic, yes, Olivia.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Olivia Lazard. I work as a fellow on geopolitics of climate change and transition with Carnegie Europe. I have a question for Mr. Azour. At COP27, we had a cover text which recognized the need to reform or at least change the thinking behind the Bretton Woods institutions. I'd be quite happy to hear from you how this conversation is now landing within the IMF, how it impacts your purview of how to deal with countries in the MENA region, knowing that some of the conversations around how to reform or how to address debt structures are more relevant at the moment with countries like Sri Lanka or Ecuador with the debt for nature swaps, which couldn't apply for MENA region. And whether or not you already have a sense of where the IMF wants to be by COP28 with this conversation. Thank you.
Sinan Ülgen, I'm in Carnegie Europe. Yukon, I have a question for you on one of your last statements. Because when you said that it's between China and the US, it's not so much about trade, it's essentially about technology. And I wanted to push you a little bit on that to draw conclusions for what that means for the rest of the world. In other words, even if it's about technology and it does not poison the trade aspect of the relationship, what will it mean for the allies of the United States? We already seen it on semiconductors, the type of pressure that was brought on, some of the Western countries. But going forward, do you see this as a major push in the future that could lead to pressure from the US to decouple from China, or not really, and this will remain more like cocooned off in that basket of technology or high technology? It's not even all of technology, I would assume. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other question? Or, okay, maybe for the second round. Mr. Jihad, would you like to start? Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is a very important question that we did not yet discuss, which is one of the key problems of the future: energy transition and climate issues. The COP27 was interesting because, in fact, we discussed several things. One is energy transition, but at the same time, energy security. And some of the speakers in the panel raised the importance of those issues in not only from geopolitical perspective, but also in the economic prospect for the next years. The second issue that also was discussed at the COP27, which is financing climate transition. With change in the financial conditions, this is getting more challenging because most of the financing has to go to emerging economies at a time where both access to finance and the cost at which one could finance long-term investment is getting more challenging. And the third is, what are the priorities? Is adaptation, is mitigation, is both? How to address all these issues? Your question is on the role of the fund. The fund, as you know, has scaled up and has been very active over the last few years in terms of providing financing to countries with new approaches. We did it during COVID with rapid financial facilities, and currently we have launched a new trust to help in financing climate transition. It's called Resilient and Transition Trust. This is, in fact, dedicated to provide long-term financing, which is new for the fund, that helps catalyze additional funding from other multilateral institutions, but more importantly, from the private sector. The objective is to help countries who cannot afford investing in transforming their economies to accelerate that. And we have $50 billion. Few countries in the region are lining up, like Jordan and like Egypt. You have asked another related question on how an institution like the fund can help in a period where, or countries where the debt has reached a very high level. And this is clearly an important issue because on one hand, you want to help countries get access to finance, but on the other hand, you don't want them to increase the level of debt, even if it is concessional, and limit their capacity to grow. Therefore, this is why we combine both short-term and medium-term reforms with additional financing that would help catalyze additional resources. Over the last 3 years, we provided to the region, over the last 2 years, more than $50 billion in terms of financing, which is higher than all institutions combined, because we recognized that the shocks were external and countries needed to respond to that. I think what is priority in the next 3 years is how to reconcile two targets. One is how to address that issue, which requires some adjustment, but how to do it in growth-friendly manner. And this is where, for example, bringing new FDIs to the region that has been declining over the last decade is a priority. And this is why we're looking at new partnerships, for example, with the oil exporting countries in the GCC, who are not only having additional liquidity or reserves, but also interested in investing in the region. We saw this recently in Egypt. We are seeing this currently in other countries, in Morocco and Tunisia, hopefully in Jordan and Lebanon soon. Therefore, it's very important to address the issue of stability, because this is the gateway for prosperity. And this is where addressing some of the macroeconomic imbalances become important, but it's not enough. And we recognize that, because if you don't create jobs for a region where unemployment has increased over in the last 3 years, especially for the youth and women, it's very difficult to address the issues of inclusion and have a growth that benefits all. Therefore, the combination of reforms, forward-looking transformation, and climate is one of them, technology is another one, and 3, support from regional and international institutions will be key. And this is something that is achievable for the region.
Complicated, but that to me is actually the major lesson. If you want to grow, you have to basically adopt the technology developed elsewhere and make use of it. China does that extremely well. But suppose you now have the US-China technology war, where China's access to technology is basically curtailed. What will happen to China? Its growth rate probably will be cut by 1 to 1.5% per year annually. That's major. That's the short term, next couple of years. But what people have not focused on, America's growth rate will be cut in half. That's actually untenable in the United States. If America grows at 2% regularly, but it ends up growing at 1% regularly for the next 10 years, it's not viable. Now, why is that? Well, because of America's major high-tech companies, anywhere from 20 to 40% of their profits come from exporting to China. And if they no longer can do so, America's high-tech companies don't make enough to basically carry out R&D. The second major interesting observation is when you talk about knowledge creation, very not well recognized, US-China collaboration in international research is the highest of any foreign collaboration. So now you have this process going on in the United States of decoupling. So you're going to have a major decline in what I call technology advancement and exchange of knowledge. All growth eventually, economically speaking, occurs from the transfer of knowledge. If you actually restrict it, basically everyone's going to be hurt.
Major challenge for the future. So any other questions to the panelists regarding the global economy in 2023? No.
No,
Okay.
Actually, I have a question.
Yes, please.
speaking about the US-China, I mean, basically, if I take your argument, this US-China rivalry is actually damaging on all fronts. But given the security considerations that are driving the rivalry, what can be done? I mean, what middle way is there to avoid this type of confrontation? And I think I'm not alone in, Europeans do not feel that they benefit from this rivalry, and I think it's the same for many other parts of the world. So what is it that could be done to change the paradigm, the terms of the rivalry, to make it more beneficial or to have better ripple effects?
Rosa, this is the major question of our times. A year and a half, 2 years ago, when the US government was formulating internally the question of restricting access to technology by not letting China buy it or to get it, and they hold a vote among the various agencies in the US, the two departments which were against restricting, you wouldn't be able to guess who they were. Department of Defense. Because the Department of Defense of the United States says, if you prohibit American companies from exporting to China, all these companies which work for us wouldn't be profitable, and who's going to fund them to carry out the research? So they realized that the security issue worked both ways. You may want to restrict China's progress, military capabilities by reducing access, but you're going to hurt America financially, okay? So the big issue is, if you start restricting semiconductors because it can be used for military purposes, you get to a class of goods which are basically dual use. And there's actually no way that you can fully restrict it. That same semiconductor could be used in a missile. It could also be used in a vacuum cleaner. And that's just what's happening in Russia today, is they're pulling semiconductors from various things and using it to create missiles, even though because they can't get semiconductors. So in my view, there's two potential ways that America and China can handle this. What do we do when we have a situation where both sides lose because they basically aren't able to handle the security issue? The answer is very much like nuclear proliferation. You reach an agreement realizing it makes no sense for both of us to be restricting each other, but we need the ability to inspect and regulate. And I think that the security issue of semiconductors and technology has to be moving down that line, because otherwise we all lose. The second way I think we could do that is partnerships. Take Huawei and 5G, and it's a big issue in Europe. And the big issue from a US perspective is we don't want Europe to get 5G. It's not secure. This misses the point. China's already getting into 6G. It's way ahead of Ericsson and Nokia. And we have a problem because if we sort of like bar Huawei technology, America and the West is going to lose access to technologies which is also being developed. So the issue would be actually, why not get Huawei, Nokia, and Ericsson to collaborate? So Nokia and Ericsson could be actually providing what I call the security-sensitive components of 5G. China could provide what I call the economies of scale of manufacturing for certain things which the West does not have. But you basically get a modality in which, if you're worried about security, there's no way that China can provide that assurance. And in fact, over the West, I wouldn't necessarily trust China. I want to make sure that we have Western companies involved directly in the process. And then we can see how it plays out. And then we try to mutually share some of the benefits. For example, right now, America is going to restrict artificial intelligence development in China. China is way far advanced in certain aspects. So instead of basically saying, I don't want China to work any further, and the world losing access to all that AI, we've got to find a way in where that knowledge is actually regulated and shared in some productive way. We don't do that. And I think that we don't have a formality, we don't have an institution to do that. So for me, the big issue is China needs access to the global economy to survive. It's heavily motivated actually to collaborate, provided it feels like the West is going to be constructive in that. And this is the difference, as I mentioned earlier, between a China and a Russia. So when we group Russia and China together, because we think we can deal with them in the same way, to me, that's a big mistake. There's a completely different way of dealing with China, which is much more productive. But we don't actually debate that or get into that too much.
Thank you so much. So just one last question from the audience, or should I close the panel? Okay, well, thank you so much to our panelists. I hope this was an insightful discussion on the global economy in 2023. We basically talked about three major shocks that have been characterizing our world in the past year: the geopolitical shock, the economic shock, and the energy shock. And we talked about the interlinkages among these three shocks, how they might affect future policy making in the EU, China, the US. We also talked about the major debt crisis in the MENA country, climate change, and we highlighted how austerity measures that will be taken in the future, the tightening of fiscal and monetary policy, will have to go hand in hand with policies that protect the poor and the most vulnerable. And at the end of our panel, we discussed the issue of technology, which will be a major variable or determinant of growth in the future. And we ended with, an interesting discussion about how we can change the paradigm of US-China rivalry. So I hope this was insightful to everyone. Thank you so much for attending. And I think, there's another panel in a few minutes. Thank you.